Hello, welcome to the ISP Tuesday Speaker Series. It is my honor and privilege to say thank you to a very old friend, Rebecca MacKinnon, for agreeing to come and give this talk today. For the few of you who don't know Rebecca's history, she wrote this amazing book called The Consent of Networked, which has aged very well. And then she was co-founder of the Global Network Initiative, founder director of Ranking Digital Rights, founder of Global Voices, and she is now vice president Global Advocacy at the Wikimedia Foundation. So she has really had a history with multiple institutions and ideas that have been foundational to how we think about the internet. Thank you for coming today, Rebecca. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Chinmay. I just want to reemphasize how honored I am to have been invited here by my dear friend, Chinmay, who I've known for a good 10 years or so, 12, something like that, working in this field that didn't exist 20 years ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit. We were talking yesterday about what would be most interesting and useful as a basis for a conversation and provocation. And Chinmay suggested that I talk a bit about my journey, my own journey in this field of ideas, and kind of how I've arrived at where I am in thinking about governance of digital platforms and what that means, and how we build, govern an internet that actually serves the public interest, that enables us to advocate for and protect our rights, and that supports open, inclusive, just societies. Where are we on that journey, and how do we get to where we want to go? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey and where I've currently landed, and to see if all of you if we can all work together as a broader community of people who care about these issues to figure out what needs to happen next. So I'm going to start in an offline analog world that once existed in some of our lifetimes. In 1995, at the UN World Conference on Women in Beijing. Now, at that time, the commercial internet was just becoming available to some parts of the world, in any case. And I was working for CNN in Beijing. At that time, I was a producer supporting film crews. I ended up becoming a correspondent, but at that time I was a producer supporting the correspondents in the CNN Beijing bureau. And we covered this big UN conference that China had lobbied to host. On the status of women. And most famously, for those of you who study, who might study the field or the evolution of human rights and gender, Hillary Clinton, who was first lady at the time, stood up at this conference and declared women's rights are human rights, which at the time was not something that was assumed actually in that kind of way. But what's relevant for this conversation is that moment in time helps to serve as a reminder for why the internet matters. We have so many conversations these days in which people say, oh, the internet has just brought so many bad things, and couldn't we go back to the internet is being blamed for everything. And it's good to unpack that a little bit and think about what that means. So in 1995, when China hosted this global conference with government people, NGOs, there were feminist activists, women's rights activists from all over the world who descended on Beijing. They did not have smartphones. They did not have access to broadband internet either back in their home countries or in China. As journalists, we did not have internet access and we did not have smartphones and we could not transmit news over the internet. So what do you do? And what did the authorities do? Well, the Chinese government constructed the conference site far outside of Beijing, so normal people couldn't interact with these civil society activists. It wasn't reachable by public transportation. It was a very isolated area. But nonetheless, a lot of these delegates from NGOs across the world were coming through Beijing on their way to the conference site. And so, as some of you might know, and some of us might even remember, disinformation campaigns existed before the internet. So what the Chinese government did to discourage the local population from interacting with these activists is they put out flyers to all the hotels and taxi cab companies and businesses where foreigners, which is the term of art in China for people who are not local to China, anywhere where foreigners visiting foreigners might be found. They sent around flyers warning people that some of the activists coming to China had been known to protest naked. And so if any of these women, NGO representatives attending the conference were to disrobe, here's the procedure you must follow. And, have blankets at the ready and, and here's who to call. And so it's just completely absurd, right? But this was all over the local Beijing newspapers and radio and so on. And so I would get in around that time in the lead up to this women's conference, I get in a taxi and the cab driver's like, oh, I'm really looking forward to all those naked women coming. And of course, parents were telling their children to stay away from anybody who looked like they might be associated with the conference. It was a great way to just completely discredit the whole thing with the local population, prevent interaction, prevent any kind of efforts at building bridges with the local public, while gaining this sort of international credibility as host of this conference. And another thing that was interesting about that conference is that I was there as part of the CNN coverage. None of the NGOs who were attending this conference could tweet about it. They couldn't blog about it because those things didn't exist. So the only way for the world to understand what they were doing, what their positions were, what they were seeking to achieve through this UN process was through the mainstream media. People like myself at the time and our correspondents and other media there. And they were very frustrated because they felt, not surprisingly, that the international media was presenting a very simplistic narrative of what was going on there. And that their stories were not being told. And fast forward a very long way from 1995 to 2004 and beyond, I had become sort of in the intervening years, very interested as the internet became available to ordinary people, but also to civil society groups, activists, citizen journalists, as we came to be called at one point, the ability to circumvent gatekeepers, the ability for people to take charge of journalism and to shape it themselves and not depend on what the editors at the New York Times or CNN or the BBC thought audiences wanted to know. Which brings me, again, very fast forward. There we go. Yeah. So, which brings me to 2004. I'm not talking about my autobiography, so I won't get into the story of how I got there, but I ended up leaving CNN. I ended up at the Berkman Center for Internet Society, as it was called then, at Harvard, which is sort of a relative of Yale ISP. And I got together with another fellow there, Ethan Zuckerman, who was there at the time, and we co-founded something called Global Voices, which we called at the time a bloggers network, or a citizen media network to empower and amplify people who were putting out their own versions of what was happening in their communities through blogs, eventually through social media and so on, and also starting to advocate for the rights of people who were using the internet to tell their own stories to the world. So we also had an advocacy arm, which then got me into policy and advocacy very quickly, because we were seeing that governments and also a lot of the press and traditional human rights groups didn't quite understand what was going on and needed help translating. And then there was a watershed moment where Yahoo, which had gone into China in 1999, ended up sharing the personal communications of a journalist named Shi Tao with the Chinese authorities. He was jailed for over a decade. This was in about 2004, 2005, when it became known, and Yahoo was kind of, attacked by human rights groups rightly for having facilitated a human rights abuse and for not having thought through the implications of hosting an email service in China and what that was going to mean. They literally had not thought it through at all. And this was the result. And also at that time, around 2005, Google was going into China with a censored search engine. Microsoft had a blogging platform at the time. They started taking down people's content at the request of Chinese authorities. And I ended up getting involved with a lot of writing and research and speaking and talking and kind of translation to the media about what this all meant. And there started to be conversations as well as hearings in Congress about what standards should we hold these companies to, right? Because Yahoo went in and their defense when asked in congressional hearings was, there's nothing we can do. If we go into China, we have to obey the law. And some of us who knew something about China, who knew something about tech, said that's BS. You can make choices. You can decide whether your server actually needs to be in China with you can decide what types of services, how you run them, et cetera. You have choices to make. And so that led to the creation of something called the Global Network Initiative, which the Berkman Klein Center, among others, was involved with kind of facilitating early conversations where we brought together human rights activists, company representatives, investors who cared about, they're now known as ESG investors. It's investors who care about the social impact as well and environmental impact as well as the returns, and academics. And, that's kind of how Chinmay and I ended up getting to know one another, to develop some basic standards, which now seem almost basic and completely inadequate. But at the time in 2008, kind of when this was all launched, it was the fact that the companies were committing to any kind of human rights standards for how they were going to handle government demands to take down content or hand over user data, or how they were going to conduct impact assessments before they decide where to put a service, was actually kind of revolutionary and new. And we forget that these standards that we expect are just, embedded. Took a while for any companies to accept it all or to sign on to. And so then moving forward, and Chinmay wanted me to talk a little bit about this. In 2012, I published a book called Consent of the Network. And this was based on a lot of work, both I've been doing related to China and the internet and the role of companies, but also a lot of the discourse I've been involved with, and was really a response to an attitude that was rife both in policy circles, in the media, and among human rights groups and civil society, that the internet was just going to liberate everyone and bring democracy, right? There was Wael Ghonim during the Arab Spring, the Egyptian blogger and programmer and Google employee who famously said, if you want to democratize a country, just give it the internet, just give it Facebook, just give it Google and Twitter, and that'll do it. And people really believed that at the time. And so my book was a bit of a pushback against that, and also drawing from some work I did for a journal article the year before I published my book on something I called networked authoritarianism, and that China was really exhibit A for how a country embraces the internet, but how an authoritarian government not only embraces the internet, but adapts to the internet and then starts adapting the internet so that it can maintain power, and not absolute total control, but enough control, enough power to stay in power, right? So it's a different way of approaching power than kind of the analog authoritarianism. But anyway, so I had a chapter in the book on that, but I was originally going to write a book that was more about China and sort of as the model for networked authoritarianism. But as I got into it, I realized this is where we're all going if we're not careful. And so when I was doing my book talks, I had this kind of simple chart. I said, you've got authoritarian countries over here and democratic countries over here. And the conventional narrative is that, thanks to the internet, we're all going to end up with, in the democratic side. That was the narrative of the day. And I said, actually, we're going to meet in the middle unless we do something about it, unless everyone takes responsibility, whether it's governments, whether it's corporations, whether it's civil society, each and every one of us in our role, unless we're taking responsibility and using, whatever our sphere of influence is as consumers, as investors, whatever, to shape, to move the needle in a direction of an internet that respects human rights, to move the needle in a direction of accountability and governance that's grounded in human rights standards, we're going to end up in a very unhappy middle. And when my book was published in 2010, the reaction, it did not sell well. And the reaction was, Rebecca, you're awfully negative. Anyway, do not fear writing books that don't sell well. One of the points that I made in my book too was, around governance and freedom and what I felt was kind of a false discourse around freedom. And this is a picture of a desert. And I quoted a friend of mine, a media scholar, Rosenthal Alves, who liked to talk about the information environment pre and post internet. And so kind of thinking back to that Beijing scenario I was talking about, before the internet, we were in an information desert. Information was very scarce. Sources of information was scarce. Ways of amplifying what you wanted to say was very scarce. It was a desert. Then the internet came and, we're suddenly in a rainforest. And governing resources, the way in which power is exercised, what the source of power is very different in a desert than it is in a rainforest. And so you have to think about governance and accountability very different. And of course, freedom isn't about doing anything you want all the time, because then you have a state of nature and only the strongest and nastiest critters have freedom, and the rest of us have no freedom whatsoever and probably get eaten. Freedom in the context of governance and accountability is the only way you're going to have freedom and rights for all of us. Which brings us then kind of in as we were getting into sort of the, roughly 10 years ago, something emerged called the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And this offers an international framework that takes human rights standards, which essentially apply to governments, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the related covenants on civil and political rights and economic and social rights, and kind of provides a framework for articulating the responsibilities of private actors. Right. So governments have the primary duty to protect human rights. They're failing that. So as they continue to fail, does everybody like Yahoo just roll over and say, oh, there's nothing I can do, the government made me do it? No, you have a responsibility to figure out how to respect human rights and to in good faith, maximize your efforts, recognizing that if governments are failing to live up to their piece, it's going to be an imperfect world, and we're all going to have to work to hold governments accountable. But as a company, as a private platform, you don't want to be a barrier to people exercising their rights and trying to hold governments accountable. You don't want to make it worse, right? So there's a whole framework around what companies need to do in terms of due diligence, in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability mechanisms with stakeholders around committing to and demonstrating that they are actually doing everything they can, whether it's in a supply chain, whether it's with digital rights, whatever, to prevent abuses of rights and not cause them or contribute to them directly. And then governments must both jointly and separately provide remedy to those whose rights are violated. And so the UN guiding principles, you don't hear a whole lot about them in the United States. And interestingly, you don't hear that much about them in law schools in the United States. You hear a lot about them in Europe. You hear a lot about them in some other international governance contexts. And increasingly, particularly in Europe, and also amongst kind of international investors and coming up with frameworks for holding companies accountable and international NGOs, it's the UN guiding principles that are being applied as a way to hold companies accountable and are being increasingly enshrined in laws in some places. So that's just something to flag. So UN guiding principles come out. I published this book. People are like, so Rebecca, you've published this book. It didn't sell very well, but you're calling for all this stuff. So now what are you going to do? Sell another book? Write another book? And I'm like, or are you going to actually do some of the things that you're calling for? And so what I ended up doing is I was a fellow at the New America Foundation at the time. And so I ended up, to make a long story short, launching a project called Ranking Digital Rights, where we took the UN guiding principles and the GNI standards and a number of other kind of standards around privacy and human rights and security and human rights, and created a framework for evaluating tech platforms and internet service providers on the extent to which they were making commitments to respect their users' digital rights and the extent to which they were actually showing, signs that they were actually doing it, right? And so we had this pretty complex methodology with a lot of indicators, kind of looking at a lot of specific questions. Won't go into it all here. You can look on the website. I'm no longer working with RDR, but it's still going. This was the website from the last ranking I was involved with. But it was a way for companies and other stakeholders to really, respond to the question of a lot of activists would go to Yahoo, they go to Google, go to Facebook. You're causing all these harms. You're awful, you need to change. And then the company would say, well, what specifically do you want me to do differently? Like, how do I change? And that was something that many NGOs were having trouble answering. And what we were trying to do is provide a very clear framework for ways that people could answer this question by evaluating very specifically the policies and practices of some particular companies. And I just want to point to the kind of governance indicators that we were looking at. By 2020, we'd done a few of these indexes, and we'd seen more and more companies adopting human rights policies. So basically taking the UN guiding principles and saying, we commit to this. We commit to respect human rights of our users. But we were seeing a lot fewer companies actually doing the due diligence necessary to understand what their risks are, what harms they might commit. and or showing evidence of trying to remedy the harms that they were identifying, and that's what you really need to do if you're actually going to make sure that you are living up to your commitments. So there's a long way to go. Also, during that period, the Ranking Digital Rights project, we also found that we had to do a bit of truth telling with governments and policymakers that we were seeing after 2016, as everybody was running around freaking out about disinformation, that a lot of policymakers were proposing laws for, outlawing disinformation, or, forcing companies to take down more harmful content, depending, however you want to define harmful. And that this was leading to we could see how this was going to lead to situations where companies were going to violate their users' free expression even more, because we could see how that was going to play out within our framework. So we started publishing some things about, it's not about the content, it's actually about the business model. And what you need to do is hold the companies accountable on their privacy practices, on how they're using their algorithms. It's about transparency and governance and accountability and due diligence. It's not about forcing the companies to censor more bad stuff. And so we worked with a lot of, obviously, academics and NGOs to kind of, we were not the only people trying to point this out. I think kind of the larger community was able to get across, at least in the US and Europe. And I think this larger policy community did succeed in influencing the Digital Services Act in Europe to be less about taking down content and more about due diligence, transparency frameworks, which was useful. And, again, we use this metaphor of upstream, downstream, don't focus on the downstream content, focus on the upstream business model that's causing certain types of content to be amplified and to be promoted and targeted to susceptible users, and that's where you need to focus. So this is a list of kind of the high-level recommendations that Ranking Digital Rights was putting out in 2020 around what companies need to do, and then also kind of how regulators and legislators need to think about what they needed to incentivize companies to do. And it's about governance, it's about human rights commitments and showing that you're doing your due diligence, your risk assessment, and that you have mechanisms to mitigate harms that you identify. It's about being transparent about how people's information environment, what can people see and not see, and why, and who has power to shape that. That needs to be clear to people. That needs to be accountable. Otherwise, we can be manipulated without realizing it, right? So we need that transparency in the system. We need it from companies. We also need it from governments. And also giving people meaningful control over how their data is collected, used, and shared, including information about what's inferred about them, giving people, again, either options to control how algorithms and machine learning is used, or only, there needs to be more regulation too about responsible use. Meanwhile, sort of as we get into 2020 and beyond, we're also seeing kind of beyond the corporate platforms, a scholarly movement and also a civil society movement around what my friend Ethan Zuckerman, who's now at UMass Amherst, likes to call digital public infrastructure, what some people call public interest technology, what Eli Sugarman, Eli Pariser, Sugarman's a different Eli. Eli Pariser likes to talk about, we need online public spaces that are public interest, that are publicly funded or collectively funded, that are nonprofit, that are civic spaces, that are not run by companies for a for-profit end. And that's similar to kind of the argument that Ethan Zuckerman makes around, we need policies that support, and we need, government funding or public funding or some philanthropic funding, some source of funding for digital public goods, digital public infrastructure, communities that develop and operate, whether it's platforms, whether it's tools that serve the interest of a particular community in terms of communicating, sharing information, organizing, whatever it is the purpose is, that they can govern themselves, that is not serving a commercial purpose of some kind. It's not meant to maximize profit for shareholders, that there needs to be more space for that. And of course, that requires policies, not just in terms of funding or antitrust or whatever, but also in terms of protecting people's ability to build and govern and content moderate in private spaces without being sued up the wazoo, which brings me to Wikimedia, where I've been now for about a year and a half, running the building and running the public policy advocacy team. And of course, Wikipedia has been around since for over 20 years, for 22 years now. So it's kind of from an older era of the internet, but it's one of the examples of digital public space, right? It's not for profit. It's a bunch of people got together and started, contributing to an open encyclopedia and built a whole bunch of rules around what is neutral fact-based content and enforce those rules. It is not a free-for-all space. It is heavily governed by volunteers who've developed rules that they enforce. And I'm going to just show you a little bit. This is the Wikipedians in Ukraine who continue to contribute to pages about the Russian invasion from bomb shelters, from wherever they can, because they care so much about making sure that the public, despite in Russian and Ukrainian, despite all kinds of censorship on the Russian internet, that there's factual, neutral information about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, the Russian government has declared Wikipedia to be disinformation and is trying to fine us. But that's another matter. So, but just speaking of how the model works, I mean, all of you visited Wikipedia, but I'm always surprised, this is the Omicron page. I'm always surprised how, the extent to which nobody's looked at the sort of behind the scenes, the edit page, the history page, and what's going on there. And the contributors are people like Neta Hussain, who's in India, who contributes heavily to medical content. She's a doctor herself. She contributes medical content to English for Wikipedia and also in a couple different Indian languages, and just making, is one of these many hundreds of thousands of people who spend volunteer time on the sidelines of whatever their specialty is to make sure the content they care about is accurate. And there's a whole kind of set of rules. Of course, you can click on the history tab and you can see every single edit that's ever been made on any page and the user account associated with it. But you can also, there's a talk page, you can actually see the rules that the community has set around that page. And in this particular one, there's some, there's an arbitration committee of, that's elected from the volunteers that's made some determinations about how they're going to enforce factual content on COVID-19 related pages. And so this is actually a simplified chart of the governance structure of Wikipedia volunteers for just in terms of, you've got people editing, you've got ArbCom, which is an arbitration body. You've got people who are known as stewards and check users and oversighters who are kind of monitoring pages for bad faith edits and spam and disinformation. And there's this whole ecosystem of governance that's built up around it. Is it perfect? No. One could, do a whole class on, actually, if I had nothing better to do, I do a PhD in political science and sociology on the governance of Wikipedia. It's really fascinating. But the point is, there's also kind of some constitutional stuff going on. There's a universal code of conduct that the board approved and that the community has also approved. And there are now kind of delegates elected from the community that are working on the whole implementation process of it and the enforcement process of it. There's also a human rights policy. We're a platform. We have to have human rights commitments, and the community needs to make sure that human rights are respected and protected in the course of contributing to and reading Wikipedia, right? So we're doing human rights impact assessments, just like Google and Facebook and so on have started to do. And we need to be accountable to our stakeholders as well. And so then just finally, I talked a little bit, we need a policy environment. And this is why Wikipedia is such a strong advocate of Section 230 remaining in place, because without intermediary liability protections, all that governance that's going on with Wikipedia editors, can you imagine if we were liable for every time somebody took down content somebody else didn't like, or did an edit on somebody's Wikipedia page that somebody didn't like? We couldn't, forget it, right? So that's where intermediary liability protections are absolutely essential to digital public spaces run by communities and the ability of communities to self-govern. And that is one piece of the Section 230 debate that absolutely gets lost. And with my team, that's kind of like our top priority to get this across to lawmakers. Of course, privacy. If you have vulnerable users under surveillance or whose data is being sold and who can't keep their identity secure, then there's a whole set of information globally that's not going to make it onto Wikipedia because people will be too afraid to contribute, or will be physically prevented from contributing. We've got people who go to jail, unfortunately, because of their edits on Wikipedia, who get threatened. We have a team that works to protect people. And of course, access. You can't access the internet while you're back to Beijing in 1995. Out of luck, right? But holding governments accountable to human rights standards is, of course, absolutely necessary. We need internet policy that is compatible with international human rights standards. It's kind of goes without saying. And then I'm going to stop and just sort of ask the question, what else? There's obviously a lot. But I think we're at a moment where there's a real opportunity. I haven't talked about Mastodon. I haven't talked about, Web3 or, any of that. But that's all kind of, part of the conversation. Is that how do we ensure that laws and policies, both in this country and globally, or at least in a critical mass of countries where civil society and legal scholars and movements can have an impact, how do we get laws and policies to better support, protect, and sustain the kind of an internet that serves the public interest and isn't just serving shareholders? It's complicated, clearly, but we're at a moment where you all at a law school are in an exciting position to help us figure out how and where we go next. So stop there.